This week on Dialogue, taking the temperature of the economic recovery. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Our guests this week are Amy Wilkinson and Roy Culpeper. Amy Wilkinson is a senior fellow at Harvard University's Center for Business and Government and a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. She's in the process of writing a book on entrepreneurial effectiveness. Roy Culpeper is a scholar with the Wilson Center's Canada Institute and is also a distinguished research fellow with the North-South Institute. His project here at the center is focused on financial sector policy and development in the wake of the global economic crisis. Welcome to the program. Thanks to both of you for joining us. You know, whenever I think there are very few issues where I feel less informed than economics. It's hard to get my mind around it. And I am always go back to the Harry Truman notion of give me a one-armed economist so he can't say, and on the other hand. So I want to start with this notion of how confident can we say that this is a full recovery? Or is there an on the other hand aspect to this? Amy?
I think we're seeing, it's pretty optimistic. I think we're seeing a pullout of the U.S. economy. Globally, I guess I may defer a little bit to what Roy says, but in the United States, we're seeing the biggest and best quarter in terms of the markets being up since 1999. So that's a look at the end of March as a quarter. We're also seeing, as of yesterday, new jobs numbers coming in for the month of March at 200,000 approximately new jobs created just this month. That's also very positive. And we're seeing in the third week of March, unemployment, people that are signing up for jobless benefits dropping the most significantly that we've seen. So I think we're right on the cusp of feeling pretty optimistic that we're moving forward. Also, the TARP's being paid back, right? So our Treasury Department bailed out our banks. That was obviously a massive thing and controversial, and the numbers are coming back in that the Treasury Department got that money back, add $24 billion. So we made money off of that. So I think it's looking pretty good.
Roy, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that economists should not only be one-armed, they should also be humble. Humility is unfortunately not a strong suit for most economists. Throughout the last decade, we kept on hearing that this expansion, this boom was here for the foreseeable future. Ben Bernanke was telling us that the great moderation had arrived. We had finally conquered inflation, instability, depression. Basically, sit back and relax was the message that seemed to be coming out of those years. And very few people, unfortunately, even those who you would think would be in the know, were able to predict the crisis and the downturn that ensued. So I think the first thing that both non-economists and economists should do when faced by predictions about the future is take it with a large grain of salt, because things often happen that you don't expect, and often in pretty bad ways.
Your answer reminds me of after the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall, this notion of the end of history, and then 9/11 happened. History made a comeback along the way. Similarly, are we looking at the right indicators? Amy, you listed a number of areas of strength. Are we looking at the right indicators, or are these sort of the indicators of the economy that just crashed several years ago? Should we be looking somewhere else?
Well, I think that one of the big reasons the economy crashed was the real estate markets and subprime loans and collateralized debt obligations.
And the housing market's weak right now.
That's right. And so I listed what I am not an economist. I'm a business background, right? So I was a former investment banker.
Which could give you an advantage in this discussion.
So I'll put a stake in the ground. I think probably more than economists will. And I'll say that in the last couple of years, it was doom and gloom. And without a doubt, it looked like we could fall off a cliff. And extraordinary things were done by the United States government and the Treasury stepping forward, the Federal Reserve Bank, et cetera, to stave off that kind of nightmare scenario. I think for the first time, it's looking pretty stable and much more optimistic. And my experience is more in the Silicon Valley, on the entrepreneurship side. I'll say that the numbers have just come out that in the last 15 years, we have never seen the entrepreneurial growth as we did in 2009, 2010. Some of that is out of desperation. Some of that is people who have lost jobs who become entrepreneurs of necessity. They create
necessity, the mother of invention.
Sure,
the old adage.
But in terms of an innovation economy or entrepreneurship, it's strengthened in the United States. So
I certainly want to come back to that in more detail, but I want to spend a little more time on gloom and doom. What are some of the weaknesses we should be looking at right now?
Well, I think there's obviously good news in the scenario, but there are some underlying weaknesses. One of the big problems running up to the crisis was these huge global imbalances. You had surpluses being piled up by countries like China and many other countries, Japan, the oil-producing countries, and those surpluses helped to fuel a lot of the speculation and the financial instability that happened in this country, in the United States. Now, those global imbalances have not gone away. So one of the underlying factors running up to the Great Depression is still before us. And as an international community, have not figured out what to do about this. We keep on talking about the Chinese letting their currency appreciate, and that would help to bring things back into balance. But that's not happening. It's not happening quickly enough. And there's some very good reasons for countries like China and other developing countries to pile up these big surpluses, because those surpluses act as an insurance war chest that helps defend them against instability. Basically, what the Asians did is they took a cue from the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s, in which things really went awry for them, and they said, never again. We're going to defend ourselves and do what we have to do to prevent ourselves from being vulnerable to speculative attack. And so the result was this decade of global imbalances, which is still with us. So I mean that's one symptom, and I would have to say we should always be cautious when we look at growth figures, because there's a ton of sins that lie beneath these rather aggregate numbers. And in particular jobs. Jobs can be of various kinds, and one of the problems that seems to be in this country is that the jobs that are being created tend to be low-skill jobs, low-wage jobs, and to a much lesser extent the kinds of high-wage, high-skill jobs that we hope that recoveries would feature large. So I think there are a number of things to be really cautious about.
Bad jobs and not enough of them, according to, there's an AP report. I was talking to you about this before we began taping, but I'll read you the details. Measured in growth, the American economy has outperformed those of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan, every group of 7 developed nations except for Canada, and that's according to the Associated Press's Global Economy Tracker, which is a quarterly analysis of 22 countries representing more than 80% of global output. Yet the U.S. job market remains the group's weakest. The U.S. had the G7's highest unemployment rate as of December. Canada and Germany have actually added jobs since the end of the recession in June 2009. This sounds like some of this hoarding of assets that you talked about, building up resources. Why aren't American businesses hiring?
Do you want me to? American businesses are beginning to start hiring.
At a higher rate, is I guess a better question. They are hiring.
So there are reasons. One is for businesses, and as a business person, it's been difficult to understand what the future would look like. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the economic uncertainty in the United States has been a pretty large issue in the last 2 or 3 years. I actually think that Washington, D.C. doesn't help that a lot. There's been a lot...
How so, Amy? What do you mean by that? You mean the debate is
the debate
not
and
useful?
The uncertainty of how much are we going to regulate banks? What is that going to look like? The banks aren't issuing credit because they're, holding their resources. Are we going to shut down the government? What's happening between our political parties? I mean, it makes it hard if you run a business to anticipate and feel real optimistic about hiring one new person, 10 new people, 100 new people. So there's been a lot of uncertainty. I think as we move towards hopefully less uncertainty, businesses will increasingly hire. That's one point. Another point is that our businesses tend to be more efficient, right? So we've squeezed a lot of efficiency, and we have less people doing bigger jobs now. And so as it looks for the United States to hire people going forward, it's going to be difficult for certain populations of people, no doubt. But I don't think it's a bad thing. I think we need to help train and assist and shift people towards more efficient, more productive industries.
Roy, what are your thoughts on this question of why, when businesses in many cases are reporting record profits, that the hiring has, Amy says it's the uncertainty. What do you think?
Yeah, I would agree with what she said. And I think it really calls for a much more proactive stance on the part of government. And here I have to say that, you know, there's a lot more clouds on the horizon than we should be comfortable with. At precisely a time when, you know, the United States should be retooling, including providing skill upgrading and training and more educational opportunities for Americans, we see the opposite happening. We see cutbacks and funding, which could be fairly draconian. President Obama was talking about investing in science. This is exactly the kind of thing that should be done, it seems to me. And
are there any countries who are, I mean, this austerity approach that you're describing seems to be the wave across the world. Are there countries that are spending more, investing more? And this is the debate that you describe in Washington, is more stimulus or more austerity? Spend, invest, cut deficits. And I'd like to hear both of your thoughts on what we need to do to keep this recovery on track.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think fiscal policy should be much more balanced over the cycle. One of the big problems for the United States when the crisis hit is that there had been several years of deep deficits thanks to the Bush administration. And don't forget that when President Bush took power, he inherited a surplus from President Clinton. And there was no good fiscal reason for running deficits during the past decade. Other countries, Canada for example, ran surpluses, and that's exactly the way the fiscal ship should be steered, that surpluses should be generated during the boom years, and that gives you the scope, the fiscal latitude to run deficits during the bust years, and that's the latitude that the U.S. simply didn't have coming to the crisis.
So where does that get us to today? What's the solution? Are we talking about raising taxes? What is the solution? Some people argue that it's not a wealth problem; it's a revenue problem as far as the government goes. That there's a lot of wealth in the country, there's just not a revenue. Corporate taxes, the share of corporate tax is 6% now, that paid by corporations. I think 6% of all tax.
Close to that. I think it's going to have to be a combined solution. I don't think there's one right answer. I think Washington, D.C. and the political divides of, you know, various voices think there's one right answer. I don't believe that there is.
Ideology versus ideology.
Right, and I think that it's going to take everyone to make some adjustments. And yes, probably taxes are going to need to be higher, and you know that is going to have to be worked out. I think that government's going to have to run more efficiently. There's massive waste across government. So I think if we're cutting and slimming down certain programs, that's a very positive thing to do. I do think the deficits are a real issue for this country, and business is concerned about that, as well as citizens, as well as political representatives. I think it's going to take everyone to come together and talk about the various solutions, and it's not going to be one-sided. That's my view.
This Washington loggerheads that we're at right now, beyond Washington, the areas you've been looking at, Silicon Valley, elsewhere, where entrepreneurial initiatives are springing up. One thing I learned from you in a previous discussion is that in these downturns, we tend to see more of these startup businesses, sort of counterintuitive.
Sure.
Talk about what's happening now. That's still the case this time around?
Oh, I think it's definitely the case. So if you look back, I mean, the history shows that Disney, Colgate, FedEx, CNN, a number of our really big businesses started in economic downturns. So you can look at the last couple years and Silicon Valley specifically, and they tend to be social media businesses. So it's this wave of technology. Facebook is something everyone's becoming pretty familiar with. 500 million people. That's a population larger than the United States, behind only China and India. There's a very large group of people now on that social network. In 2008, Groupon came out of Chicago. That's not Silicon Valley, but it's a model very similar. They turned down an offer for, we'll see if this is a smart move or not, for $6 billion from Google a couple years ago. They plan to go public. LinkedIn, that social network's got 100 million people. So there are lots of examples of Silicon Valley innovation that's happened during this recession. Some of it's becoming pretty familiar. Some of it is still under the radar screen, and we'll see it in the next couple years in terms of really the market's understanding what people were working on during this period.
One of the things we hear is that banks aren't lending money at a rate high enough to support these initiatives. Is that the case still?
I actually don't think that. I think in the innovation economy, there is too much money. I mean, the venture capital, sure. So the venture capital community has got a lot of money, and they've been chasing ideas in the last 2 or 3 years. And so it's been a fantastic time to be an entrepreneur. If you had the right skill set in computer science, math, engineering, if you just had a good idea, it didn't even have to be a tech idea. The venture capital, the National Association of Venture Capitalists, they are putting out numbers that basically say their industry will constrict significantly. But it's not because there's not enough money. It's in fact because there's so much money and not enough good ideas that tier 2 firms, tier 3 firms, et cetera, will go away. Mm-hmm. So in that space of our economy, it's been very robust.
Some good news.
Right.
Roy, in the developing world, I just read a figure that 70% of the U.S. economy is driven by consumers and consumption. Mm-hmm. Clearly, this is not a model that is replicable around the world in a way that could drive a robust recovery. So what's happening in the developing world?
Well, I mean, consumption always looms large in any economy, whether it's developed or developing. The big difference, of course, is that in most developing countries, people are much poorer than they are here, so their consumption level is considerably lower. What's happened in the developing world? Well, there's a couple of things worth noting. First of all, that the recession and the crisis was less severe for a lot of them than it was for the United States.
Why is that? Less to lose?
Well, because they didn't go off the deep end to the same extent in terms of financial speculation and the kind of excesses that we saw in the financial markets. And in fact, many developing countries had encountered financial crises a few times in the past 20 or 30 years. So they actually enacted reforms, thanks to pressure from the IMF and the World Bank, that tightened up their regulation and supervision. The irony, of course, is that the place from whence this advice was coming, Washington, was precisely the place that wasn't tightening up the regulations and supervision. So where the developing countries were putting their houses in order, unfortunately, the United States and Europe were just doing the opposite. And then, to go beyond that. I mean, it's certainly not good news in many parts of the developing world. For example, in the first decade of the century, after 3 or 4 decades of doom and gloom, stagnation and decline in sub-Saharan Africa, there seemed to be a turnaround, in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and they were reaching, I'll use this aggregate number, 6-7% growth rates, which promised, if they're sustained over the long term as they have been in Asia, to finally turn around the outlook and to reduce poverty in a sustainable way in sub-Saharan Africa. Unfortunately, then the crisis erupted, and that undercut, in the first instance, the markets of a lot of these countries, and thereby undermined their growth to the 2-3% region. And so we're back to sort of business as usual, unfortunately, for that part of the world.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the criticisms you hear is that the same people who drove us to the edge of the cliff are the same people who are working on the solutions. The people in and out of government who are involved at that highest level. And so as a result, we don't tap into other ideas. I'm wondering, as you're looking around the country and the world, what are some of the best ideas that you're hearing that are not penetrating yet the Washington bubble?
Best ideas for what?
Best ideas for the economy, just for adjustments to the way that striking this balance between regulation and free enterprise. You know, all the various things that people say must be part of a solution. What are some of the better ideas that you're hearing out there that aren't making it into the conversation?
So I'll talk about one, which is this H-1B visa reform. This is specific for the United States. If we really want to boost the job generation engine here, it's the innovation economy for this country. And one of the ways we can do it that's not talked about enough is to welcome more foreign-born immigrants. And April 1st is the deadline where we've got the H-1B visa application process. Every year, April 1st, it opens up. The Congress caps that number at 65,000 H-1B visas. It fluctuates slightly year to year, but we let 65,000 foreign-born computer scientists, engineers, many of them U.S. trained by our universities. We let them stay and work in companies in the United States or found their own companies in the United States. I think that number should be multiples of what it is. And the reason is that we're training these people in our university systems, and then we're forcing them to leave our country.
Is that a politically viable idea right now? I think of Tom Friedman speaking from this very space where we're sitting a couple months ago, said that his definition of a broken system is that when an optimal solution is apparent, but not only can we not enact it, we can't even talk about it. He used the example of an energy tax, but in this case, you're talking about immigration reform in an opposite direction than a lot of the political debate has been.
I think that this part of immigration reform needs to get carved out. I mean, we've got a massive immigration reform dialogue going on. Most of it is not about this subsection of our immigrants. If you look at the companies we mentioned, Google, eBay, Yahoo, Intel, they all have foreign-born founders. Those are huge businesses employing large numbers of Americans and others around the world. But I think if we could carve that out as an issue, almost everyone would agree to it.
Best ideas you're hearing?
Yeah, I mean, I'd answer your question, John, by saying that if you look at the winners of the economic growth sweepstakes of the last 50 years, who are they? We think of China in the first instance because they're the newest kid on the block, maybe. But there are a number of Asian countries, Japan being the first in a series, South Korea, Taiwan, much of Southeast Asia. And the model that these countries have followed, and India is now among them, is one of much more interplay between government and the private sector. And so what I'm talking about here is the need for industrial policy, which is anathema still, I imagine, to many people in this town, but it's actually what made the Asian economies tick, and tick so well and tick so long over time. This is not, I'm not making an ideological statement here, I'm just saying that it actually works better that way if the government can sort of work with the private sector so as to reduce the uncertainty that they face and to work on things such as investing in infrastructure, investing in skills and education. All of these things are good for the private sector, and yet if you don't have them, the free market simply doesn't work so well.
You're not stating it as an ideologue, but you know, ideologues will hear it, and they'll hear more government regulation, more what you call investment. They'll see as more government spending. So I just wonder, where can the leadership come from if the debate in this town isn't really echoing what both of you have been saying?
So I'll give...
Who will lead us out of the woods?
Maybe it's public-private partnerships, and I'll go back to the example of the Startup America initiative. So that is piloted out of the White House, but the people leading it, the person in charge is Steve Case. He's the founder of AOL. The chairman of it is Carl Schramm, the head of the Kauffman Foundation for Entrepreneurship. And the money behind that is HP, IBM, Intel, Facebook, et cetera, moving hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, that's not on the scale that government can move money, in the billions of dollars. But that is an interesting new model, potentially, of White House platform and private sector really doing the initiative. So there's, a glimmer of hope there.
Mm-hmm. Are there examples around the world of governments that are taking closer to what you see as the right path in this regard?
Well, I think the European governments, by and large, have always had much more room and political space for private sector, private-public partnerships, but also more room for social welfare and supporting people who need it. That's very much part of the whole picture, because if you don't have that, if you have increasing inequality, as you're finding, almost everywhere, but particularly in the U.S., then that leads to a number of tensions, both social and political as well as economic, that undermine the social fabric. And so, these, I think, very commonsensical notions seem to be lost in an environment where people look after themselves and don't think about the community and the fabric of society.
A 10-second response from each of you. Sorry to do this, but time is tight. If you were economic czar or president or ruler for a day, where is the action? Where do you think the investment should be? Where do you see the greatest potential for a return in the future?
Well, in public goods such as education and health, healthcare is something that really needs reforming, and it seems to be in trouble. Investing in infrastructure, these are all things that the public sector should and must do.
Okay, Amy?
I think it's in education, and I think it's a certain kind of education that promotes entrepreneurial spirit and initiative.
Interesting. A lot of what you're talking about is where we're cutting right now, so stay tuned. I guess we're still in a recovery, but let's hope it can hold. Thanks very much for your insights. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Milewski. Thanks for watching.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.